Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Garnet Jenis, Member of Parliament, your host here for another episode of Resuming Debate. Thank you for your interest. And of course, we cover the gamut of topics here. The mix of the long range ideas based work, and then also the up to the minute political conversation. So today we're talking about a very specific bill that is before Parliament, and I like using this platform to bring your attention to legislation before Parliament that may not be grabbing the headlines, but is still substantively very important for the future of the country. And I've found that over the last 8 or so years I've been an MP that, you know, the saying, if it bleeds, it leads. There are things that bleed and get a lot of attention in the media, but then there may be substantive important things where there's cross-party collaboration happening, and it doesn't get the same level of attention. So Bill C-281 is a private member's bill from Philip Lawrence. It's the International Human Rights Act that's going to, if it makes its way through the legislative journey, I think have a big impact on the role that Canada plays defending international human rights. And I'm very pleased to have the sponsor of the bill, my friend and colleague, Philip Lawrence. Philip, thanks for joining the podcast today.
It's great to be here, Garnet. It's a real pleasure to be on the podcast, and look forward to having a great discussion about C-281. And of course, Garnet, I'm sure all of his listeners are aware out there, had a big impact on this as well, and really appreciate all the support and collaboration that I enjoyed working with you, as well as some of the other parties as well. It might surprise some of the listeners as well. So.
Great. Yeah, well, we'll talk about that, because I think it will be interesting to give people a little bit of a window into the legislative process, the fact that in a minority parliament things are way more dynamic, because in a majority parliament you basically know that the government's position is going to prevail, and in a minority parliament there's these multi-dimensional negotiations which we're in the midst of about the specific provisions. But can you start off by just giving people an overview on the different aspects of the bill? What, you know, as the name suggests, it relates to international human rights, of course, but what are the specific provisions of the bill? What's it going to change?
For sure. Well, it's an omnibus human rights bill, and so there's 4 different main topics contained within. And Garnet, you know the bill probably better than I do, so feel free to jump in if I'm going off course there. But so the first provision is with respect to prisoners of conscience, and so I certainly heard in exploring the bill and having discussions with stakeholders that prisoners of conscience, those are being held against their will because of their political or religious beliefs, or they often told me that they felt like they were being forgotten about by this Liberal government, and they wanted a way for people to know about their situations. And so one of the things that the bill contains is the ability to publish a list, and we're working on amendments to make sure that that really represents what the families want. But the government would publish that list, and then the hope would be to attract awareness and notoriety, and then so Canadians can rally around people both abroad and Canadians here that have family members that are being held against their religious and political beliefs. The second provision would be with respect to the Magnitsky Act sanctions. Of course, we've put governments put sanctions around the world to hope to change behavior. The Magnitsky sanctions, of course, often are aimed at individuals, and unfortunately, this Liberal government has failed to make the most of those. And so, what this calls for is an ability to have parliamentary oversight. Particularly the Foreign Affairs Committee would have the ability, as well as other committees, but primarily the Foreign Affairs Committee, to ask the government as to why you haven't put Magnitsky sanctions on this individual, and to make that explanation. It's important to say that it doesn't give a full trigger, as exists in different places in the country, where different countries in the world, I should say, where actually parliaments or Congress in the U.S. can put in Magnitsky sanctions by themselves, or lead the way anyways. Here we're just asking for an oversight. So a very reasonable request. The next section has to deal with the Broadcasting Act, and what this provision does, it gives the CRTC the ability to cancel the renewal of a broadcasting license if in fact a regime that has been found to have committed genocide is using those potentially for foreign interference purposes. And of course, Grant, you might have seen a little bit about foreign interference in the news. I know that you haven't been very involved in that topic at all, but and then finally is with respect to clusters munitions. Of course, the Harper government was a leader in the signature of the anti-usage of cluster munitions, and what this particular provision is with respect to the financing of the manufacture and procurement of cluster munitions. And so a great activity. I mean, it's really, you know, I spend most of my time on the very boring area of finance and taxes. Well, it's not boring to me, but probably to most of your viewers are. But this was really one of the reasons why I wanted to become an elected official to begin with. It's really the ability to make hopefully a little bit of difference in someone's life across the world, and as trite as it sounds, to make the world hopefully at least just a little bit better of a place.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great overview. And let's drill down into some of the individual sections. I guess one of the major threads in this bill is the idea that enhancing accountability to Parliament on international human rights issues is important for moving the issues forward. That very often, I think this government, but potentially governments in general, are less responsive to human rights pressures than legislators or than parliaments are, and that Parliament acts as the representative of the people in our system, of course, but also in a sense as the conscience of the public, that when the public is calling for us to take principled stands on issues, that is transmitted to the government through people's representatives. And sometimes left unchecked, governments are liable to make compromises of fundamental values that serve short-term interests. It may not always be that case, but in my experience with international human rights work, generally there's a lot of pressure that comes from parliaments onto governments to do better when it comes to standing for fundamental values, universal human dignity, for the ideas that are embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that human rights are inherent, immutable, and must be recognized. So the idea of saying government has to be accountable to Parliament by doing an annual report, by responding to motions of parliamentary committees calling for someone to be sanctioned. These parliamentary accountability mechanisms for human rights are important at ensuring there's pressure on the government to do better on human rights.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with all of that. I liked your conscious take. I'm perhaps just a little bit simpler with respect to us. We are the representatives of the people. And I think I don't know whether this is going too far, but I think there's at least the argument that there's been an erosion of the power of Parliament in Canada, really around the world, and it seems as our world gets increasingly complicated, our government gets increasingly technocratic, and I am one who firmly believes that that Canadians know what are best for Canada, and that's what separates us from many authoritarian regimes around the world and governments in places where perhaps we would prefer not to live, is the parliamentary supremacy. And it's the ability that, and I don't believe that I'm anything special, but I am the conduit of 100,000 plus people from Northumberland, Peterborough South, and I do believe that they are special. And so whenever I see Parliament's power getting eroded, I'm not concerned for Garnet, but I am concerned for the people of Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Have I got that
Very
right?
good, yeah.
All right, and
I always butcher your writing name, so
and so I am concerned from that standpoint, that when we don't have the people say, we reduce our or at least in some small way reduce our legitimacy and our ability to govern there. So
yeah. I think that's such a great point, and especially in the area of foreign policy, right? Because I think sometimes the tendency is to say that foreign policy is a domain for the foreign policy experts, but our foreign policy is the extension beyond our borders of our own pursuit of the common good, right? We pursue our collective understanding of the common good domestically, and we seek to project an image of that common good and defend the space for our version of the common good in world affairs. The importance of democratic control of foreign policy is that it should be through democratic deliberation that we define what our concept of the common good as a nation is. It should not be foreign policy experts in a particular discipline of international relations, let's say, who are defining what our interests should be apart from the democratic will of a nation. So, what I see often is that democratic pressure to prioritize justice and human rights, and maybe some so-called realpolitik foreign policy experts that are that are critical of that. And I don't mean to be overly down on the role of expertise either. I think politicians that are wise listen to experts, but the role of expertise is to serve the objectives that are defined through democratic deliberation.
No, 100%. I mean, absolutely. It is a job of the experts to provide that great information. And that information has to be absorbed by the elected officials as a representative. But ultimately, it should be the people's representative that are making major substantive decisions. And that's my point there. Like, why I absolutely understand the value of having that expertise, and we need that expertise. But it's at the end of the day the people who should make those substantive decisions. And to me, that's basic common sense. But I'm sometimes surprised around these halls at that being almost a novel concept, that there shouldn't be the deferral of that. And what I remember from my first year international relations course, and one of the professors saying that, and I think this still is more or less true, is that liberal democracies generally don't go to war with liberal democracies. And I think part of the reason why that is because when you have the people who are going to lose their loved ones or maybe even lose their lives themselves, it gives you that second reflection. And one of the great accomplishments of liberal democracies are, as I said, they tend not to go to war with each other, and so that becomes it becomes an excellent peace and stabilization. And so, to your point, I mean, certainly there are times in foreign affairs when we need decisions made by the executive, and there isn't time for contemplation from the parliament. And maybe that's some of the reason why people tend to put this in the sphere of the executive as opposed to the legislative bodies. But in general, I believe that the more we can get people's eyes to these things, the more we can give parliament the ability to have their say. And of course, as I said, it's just really the people's voice through us. I believe that the historical evidence would show that in general, everyone has a higher level of prosperity, less chance of war, and greater stability, right? So.
Yeah. That really kind of drills into the idea of requiring the government to do more reporting to Parliament around human rights, and then also the parliamentary trigger issue that for sanctions. That if a parliamentary committee passes a motion for someone to be sanctioned, the government should have to provide a substantial response to that request. Let's talk a bit about the Broadcasting Act, because this is, I think, a really important area for human rights, but it's maybe not where people would initially think. We're doing a human rights bill, and we have amendments to the Broadcasting Act in it. The issue is that there is often a complicity by so-called media in human rights abuses in authoritarian contexts. For instance, with the communist regime in Beijing, there is a complicity of so-called media organs in extracting and broadcasting forced confessions from those that face unlawful detention, right? And the position that you have taken with this bill is to say that these organizations that are in some sense involved in human rights abuses, they shouldn't have the benefit of being able to have a broadcasting license here in Canada. At committee, we heard some people say, "Well, what about freedom of speech?" And you've countered that, hey, freedom of speech doesn't include the right for a foreign state to torture someone and put that image on Canada's airwaves. So maybe share a bit about how you kind of respond to some of those potential criticisms and how you see the role of the Broadcasting Act in keeping out this kind of authoritarian content.
Yeah, I think we need to have a little bit of a broader context to properly form this section. Whether we're talking about trade, of course, conservatives are the party of free trade, as well as we are also the party of free speech. But we can't live in a glass house of naivete. We have to be aware of the world has changed. And I really do believe over the last decade, with the rise of the communist regime in Beijing and also the unprovoked illegal invasion into Ukraine by Russia, the world has changed. And so we have to be a little bit more protective of Canada and Canadians. And so to the extent that a foreign regime is using our airways to broadcast their propaganda, that really ceases to be free speech in any meaningful way. That is an attempt to mislead, misinform Canadians, and can be a very dangerous thing. And you have to picture yourself as perhaps a newcomer to Canada, and you are getting broadcast. You're getting intimidated by the very airwaves that Canadian taxpayers are helping to support. And you've fled in many cases thousands of miles, left loved ones behind, left your a lot of times economic well-being behind for the freedom of living in Canada, and that is being compromised by foreign actors actively trying to interfere in Canadians' well-being. So it's actually, I believe, a preservation of freedom that requires this legislation to be in place. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think the other thing is like the discussion of misinformation, right? I tend to think this is a term that gets misused a little bit. There's a lot of misinformation about misinformation, in that if one party is saying something the other party is thinking is wrong, they may invoke the term misinformation, right? And if by misinformation you simply mean lying, there's a certain amount of that's just part of freedom of speech, right?
Yep.
Like I don't think the state should be there to say, well, we need to make this person be quiet. But I think there's a difference between individual speech and government speech. And whether that government speech is foreign government speech or domestic government speech, there's just a different category of concern and intervention that's legitimate when you have a foreign government using taxpayer dollars from that country to fund a big bullhorn and bring it to Canada and try to participate in our conversations. Like it's free speech should be about fair debates among free people, not about a public square in which a foreign autocratic state can bring their megaphone and blow over everybody else. So there's the human rights abuses component of it, but I think in general we need to understand foreign authoritarian states misinformation as being in a very different category from what Joe citizen in Canada may say that may be wrong and misinformed. If a free citizen is saying something that's wrong or misinformed, that's their right. But if a foreign actor is bringing a megaphone to the table in our debate, I think that's illegitimate.
No, I agree 100%. There's just a whole lot of difference between an individual in Alberta having a podcast and discussing political issues, and maybe members of another political party might feel differently about that. And it's been said that if freedom of speech isn't really freedom of speech if you can't say things that are offensive to other people, right? That at that point, what really is, because it's guaranteed that nearly everything that someone's going to be offended by. But there is a marked difference between that and a predatory regime attempting to utilize Canadian airwaves to manipulate the population of Canadians, right? And in some ways intimidate expatriates who are now in Canada, right? So 100% agree, and that's the same point I make with respect to economics. I am, as a conservative, very committed to free trade, but there's a lot difference between trading with Denmark and the communist regime in Beijing, right? Denmark, for the most point, is not trying to use their corporate assets, their businesses, to gather intelligence about Canadian business and the Canadian government. I don't think the same can be said of a lot of state-owned enterprises by the communist regime in Beijing.
Yeah, totally. And like if we believe in limited government control in people's lives, that should apply with domestic governments and foreign governments, right?
Right.
And so as conservatives, if we take the individual freedom, subsidiarity, limited government perspective, that means not allowing foreign governments to do what we don't want our government doing as well, whether that's in the flow of information or in the economic sphere, right? So maybe just concretely, I mean, do you want to share some of the things you've heard about? I mean, the obvious example here is Chinese state-controlled media that's being broadcast in Canada, right? And there was RT, Russian state-controlled media, but that's been taken off the airwaves, and it's probably a certain inconsistency that's happened with Russian state-controlled media, but not with Chinese state-controlled media. But what are the specific things you're hearing about that media, what's being published, et cetera?
Yeah, we hosted a great town hall with respect to this bill, and I think we heard lots of conversation. I know I had conversation both at the podium and then just a one-on-one about predatory state actors utilizing Canada. I mean, we've also seen the story of the quote unquote police stations that the communist regime in Beijing had, and intimidating people into belief. Whatever the extent of the foreign interference that the regime in Beijing is committing, there's no doubt it's being committed, right? There were 11 parliamentarians that CISA said were potentially I guess victims of potential influence, if you wish to be that generous. And so we have to be serious about this. Like I said, I think there's really been a shift in the way that the world sort of operates. There's always been an attempt to sort of interfere and push between countries, but the calculated level of it. That combined with a level of technology has given the ability of foreign state actors to at least attempt to interfere in Canadian elections, which has already happened. We already know that from CSIS, and so. As you said, as a conservative, we want to have limited government, but that also means protecting the population from foreign interference and having other foreign governments actually be the control of information. And you have to remember, if you're coming to Canada, if you're a newcomer to Canada, your ability to get information will be a little bit different than someone who's well versed in the culture and the language. You may be dependent on particular channels of information, and if those channels are being unduly influenced by foreign actors, that's something as Canadians we have to be aware of, right?
Yeah, great points. Let's switch over to the cluster munitions. Tell us a bit more about the cluster munitions provisions of the bill and what's important there, and what's the state of play as well on possible amendments to those sections.
Yeah, so we have the cluster munitions bill, which seeks to limit the ability of individuals to finance, Canadians to finance, Canadian business to finance the construction and the building of cluster munitions. There were some concerns, and I think they were legitimate in the original bill, that it was perhaps overly broad, but we've been able to work with Mines Action Canada, actually a great NGO who are working to actively limit the amount of landmines and cluster munitions which are in the world. And just so everyone may back up a half a step, cluster munitions are just bombs within bombs, and so they are extremely imprecise and really more weapons of terror than they are of war, because you have very limited ability to control them, because the little bomblets will spread throughout. Often they land in civilian areas, and worse yet, often they're unexploded bombs or unexploded ordnances that are hanging around in areas for years and years. And so Garnet and I may have a little bit of differences in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, but I'm sure the one thing that we would agree upon is, whether you're in Armenia or Azerbaijan, the idea of there being unexploded cluster munitions all around is troublesome. And there's been stories of children, because they're often little shiny things, grabbing them and playing them like toys. And unfortunately, we can all understand what would have happened in those instances. And so these weapons of terror, they're not even terribly useful in some of the discussions I've had with experts in the field when it comes to war, are extremely detrimental and often kill civilians and like I said, even children, sometimes decades after they were actually dropped. And so what, like I said, this bill does is it seeks to undermine any ability to finance the construction or manufacture of cluster munitions. Originally, the bill was a little bit, like I said, overly broad, but as I said, we were able to work with Mining Action Canada and actually import some language in from the Netherlands with respect to an exception that makes sure that that it's sufficiently precise that it targets those individuals who are actively financing cluster munitions while not accidentally bringing in people who may be accidentally invested in a company that would be creating cluster munitions.
Yeah, so I think Canadians are probably more familiar with landmines than they are with cluster munitions. But essentially, there's a similar principle there, right? Landmines are potentially useful in a conflict situation, but we've generally determined as a global community, although landmines are still being used, they're being used extensively by Russia, sadly, but that landmines, because they often stay behind after a war. They cause a lot of civilian damage, and lots of horror stories out there about children out playing, stepping on a landmine that's have been there for a long time and blowing up. Similar kind of situation with cluster munitions, where very imprecise weapons, unexploded things left behind, and regardless of potential usefulness in war, we've tried to establish norms around not having these things used, and preferring more targeted short-term weapons that are used one army against another army. Is that a fair sort of summary of the discussion around this generally?
Yeah, and whether you're cleaning up landmines or cluster munitions, often they're actually used in the same area. So you're cleaning
Right.
up both. It is painstaking work, and it can take years and years and decades
Right.
to clean them up, and it can cost millions and millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And so it just eliminates the ability for large swaths of land to be used, and often they're in areas where there are economic challenges. So people are desperate to either make use of the land to farm it because they've got no other option, or they are desperate to get somewhere, maybe see loved ones on the other side of a conflict or otherwise. And so that desperation often means that they're compelled to go through very dangerous areas where unexploded cluster munitions or landmines are, and the results are and like I said, it just is so imprecise. And like I said, especially with cluster munitions, my understanding and talking to a bunch of the NGOs and stakeholders is that their utility in war is even limited, and so we are causing this type of havoc to the civilian population for no real gain with respect to advancing a military action or otherwise.
Yeah. Very, very heavy things to be dealing with and talking about, but it's good to take this on. And it is very sad that some of these weapons are being used in the context of Ukraine, and of course, Ukraine is an important agricultural power, and uses and the impact on farming in particular is one industry. When you have landmines or cluster munitions, I think that the same principle would apply, right? So Phil, let's talk a bit about the process around this bill, because of course I'm asking the questions knowing a little bit of the answer already, working with you on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we kind of foreshadowed this earlier, but when you're in a majority parliament, you kind of know the way it's going to go. The government decides what they want to do, and then they get what they want, right? Whereas in a minority parliament, we kind of shape it through these dynamic negotiations between different parties, and we're in the clause by clause stage now. We're releasing this on Tuesday the 25th, and we're right in the thick of these sort of multi-dimensional wordsmithing conversations around the legislation. How have you found that dynamic? And I think it will be interesting for people to just realize that these things are really how the sausage making happens, right? People tend to assume it's all about party leaders and abstractions, but actually there's there's MPs involved in sausage making, wordsmithing at committees that decide what kind of bills we're going to end up with.
No, I mean it's from a personal level, it's been really exciting and interesting. I've actually had 4 private members initiatives, and this is my 4th. And actually, 2 of them have been picked up by the government. The 3rd was they attempted to but failed, and now we've got another. We've got Ben Love's private member's bill on exemption of the carbon tax. But and so my opponent, Garnet, on the night that I won, had the great quote of saying, "Good luck with your backbench opposition member, Parliament, Northumberland, Peterborough
Right.
South." And so I'm very proud of the record of what we've been able to get accomplished. And yeah, with respect to 281, it's been quite the process. The government has been somewhat resilient or resistant in going forward with some of our language, which is a bit interesting because on some of these issues they'd had different tacks in the past. I don't want to be too flip here, but an unnamed member of the government did say to me that once that being in government isn't about giving the opposition wins.
Right.
And sometimes, be candid, I felt a little bit of that, Garnet. But that being said, I've been very pleased at the work we've done with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, and able to get support for our legislation going forward. The NDP particularly have been very helpful, and while providing amendments that would be valuable to their stakeholders, have been generally supportive, and I earnestly believe they want to get this legislation passed as well. And quite frankly, that's actually been my experience with my 2 other private members' bill. One was from the Senate with respect to charities, and had NDP support for that until the government picked it up and made it part of their legislation, their budget. And also with the carbon tax, it was an exemption for farmers. In that case too, the NDP supported us as well. So that might shock some of the folks in Alberta, I know, who are listening in there, but we've actually worked well to get those legislation done. But it is amazing. I will tell the viewers that our listeners out there that their MP, if it is their MP, Garnet, is amazingly talented, and a number of the provisions he has drafted law literally just right there in time, in real time, and very impressed, Garnet, with your ability to take a concept and put it into law, and to get agreement from around the table.
Well, it's a pleasure working with you, Phil. I have lost the draw every time for being able to bring forward my own private members' bills, but it's been a pleasure working with you and others on great private members initiatives. I was just going to say, in terms of your comment about the NDP, what makes the area of foreign affairs and international human rights kind of interesting is that these issues don't fit as neatly onto a left-right spectrum, right? Like, it seems to me that probably on the finance committee, you kind of know where people are going because of where they are ideologically, right? You've got a kind of a spectrum of thinking about the role of government in the economy, and there may be exceptions to that, but broadly speaking, you kind of follow it on that spectrum, right? For our colleagues on the environment or natural resource committees, chances are you kind of know where it's going to land based on the starting orientation of the parties at the table. Foreign affairs is quite different from that, and on international human rights issues, there's been a tendency of the liberals to be the worst, honestly, and of some opposition coalitions to come together. That's not always the case, right? There are some issues where we see human rights very differently, or we understand it differently, right? And I think the NDP has been particularly keen on issues around disarmament, right? And they go further than we do on disarmament in terms of we believe we're a little bit more inclined to, and in specific cases, to err on the side of saying, giving our military the tools they need in certain situations are important. I mean, I think they would say that too. I'm trying to be fair here. I think they would say that too, but I think we would, they would go a bit further than us on certain disarmament issues. We probably talk more about religious freedom issues, for example, as part of human rights. So there are some variations, but generally, in terms of this tension between do we stand up for justice and universal human dignity, or are we living in the world of sort of foreign policy elite realpolitik? There are these like left right coalitions that are opposing the center, right? So that's what makes this interesting, right? Is that from one provision to another, you're kind of not sure how it's going to land, and you're making alliances with people that you don't otherwise agree with on lots of other things.
No, I think you're right there. I mean, one of the things that I think connects the NDP and the Conservatives on some of the issues is, and it's different in the domestic context, but here, of course, Conservatives want to see individuals protected, their rights protected. Oftentimes in the domestic context, that means from the government. After all, it's governments over the last 100 years that have committed the majority of the worst atrocities that we could rattle off. And so it's our job as Conservatives to protect those individuals from governments that seek to overstep and to unduly limit those rights. Now the NDP would, in the domestic context, would perhaps say, well, we need the government to protect those rights, right? To be generous to them. But in international context, they're no longer sort of beholden to the state being the great provider, great protector, and they sort of join us as protectors of the individual against the overseas steps and outrages of the state. So that's where I think we sort of come together on human rights now. The Liberals seem to be a little bit more beholden to their sort of statist elitist ideology, and perhaps that's why they don't go as far. Now, I will note that they act a little bit different in government than they do in opposition.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I think that's another one of the interesting dynamics on your bill, right? Is that like your bill creates obligations on government, things that make the government more accountable to Parliament. So just by instinct, the government of the day is going to be more resistant to that, and the opposition of the day is going to be more supportive of that. Of course, the point you and I have made continually in these discussions is that, hey, governments change, right? And
yeah.
when you change law, you don't just put in place rules that bind one government. You change the law, and that new law is in place unless and until a new government changes that law. And so it's worthwhile for people that are in government today to think about how laws that strengthen parliamentary accountability or weaken parliamentary accountability will impact them when they are in opposition.
100%. And I believe in, like I said, parliamentary oversight, regardless of who's in the government of the day. But I could certainly see this bill actually causing some frustration to a future Conservative government, as it does give Parliament the ability to hold the government to account, which I believe is a great thing. But as we've had the discussion with the Liberals, I mean, I personally do believe that we'll be in government sooner rather than later. And if that is the case, there are many tools that they could utilize to make sure that we don't stray from the path, and that they're holding us accountable to our words with respect to international human rights. And I'm not sure, they don't seem to voice much of support for that. Maybe they do believe they'll be in government forever, but I certainly don't believe that to be the case.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic there too. And so what's next for the bill? Give folks a rundown kind of where we're at process wise, and what's coming down the pipe in terms of, is this the general expectation is that private members' bills don't get that far in minority parliaments. You've had more success than most in that regard, though. So what's ahead for the bill?
Well, thanks to the great guidance of our Shadow Minister for International Development, Mr. Garnet Jennis, I'm hopeful
Phil,
that
people are going to think I just brought you on because you're going to say nice
to
things.
pump your tires. Yeah.
Come on, yeah.
But there's, I mean, we'll see. This history may quickly prove that I'm overly optimistic, but I do believe that there's a chance we could get through clause by clause tomorrow, which is Tuesday, and then from there we would have a vote. Sorry, we've got Garnet, help me out here.
Well, once it's done at committee, then it goes to third reading in the House. And so that will depend on your ability to, find slots to trade up for, but, and then it's got to go through the Senate. But
exactly. Yeah. So then we'll have the vote, which will be hopefully relatively quickly. I don't think it's crazy to say we could get it done this year, and get it passed into law. Hopefully the Senate will be kind to us.
Yeah.
And I've already gotten the names of a couple of senators I should be talking to, and so if I'm sure that all the senators listen to this podcast, and so
Absolutely, every last one.
If they have any questions, please contact Garnet and I immediately there.
Yeah. Well, we've had our fair share of senators on the podcast. I think we had you worked on the direction and control issue. I think we had Senator Omitvar on talking about that issue as well. So lots of the Senate plays an important role in the legislative process too. Again, in terms of that whole actual writing of legislation, the people folks hear from in the media, party leaders and commentators and that sort of thing. But individual MPs and senators play a big role when it comes to hashing through these pieces of legislation. So, Phil, thank you for your good work on this, and I'll pay you later for all the positive shout outs there. And any final comments, any final points you want to leave with people, maybe suggestions for how they can help, and any other comments about what we can do as a country on international human rights?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Some of the ideas that came in this legislation came from individuals and stakeholders, and in a minority government, I think we stand a reasonable chance of getting a conservative-led international human rights bill. So getting involved is so critical. You really can make a difference, and it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you on this, Garnet, and I can't wait to have a celebratory adult beverage with you when this becomes law there, my friend.
Excellent. Yeah. Wonderful. Bring out the red Solo cups. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. This is great. We've gone a little bit shorter than usual today, but Phil's got to get back to prepping his final round of amendments here, because we are recording this on Monday night, releasing it as you'll see on Tuesday. We are right in the thick of it, and follow myself and Phil on social media to see updates on the progress of Bill C-281. We release episodes of Resuming Debate every 2 weeks, and we'll be back here in 14 days with another episode. Please leave a review. If you like what you hear, you like the conversations we have. Sometimes I bring colleagues from our party on. Sometimes I bring people from other parties on. Sometimes we have conversations with experts, historians. If you like this conversation, hopefully you'll leave a review, you'll subscribe, and you'll be back again in 14 days for another episode of Resuming Debate.